just Rory, just nothing from WDS. So I think we'll be done early.
Yeah. So I'm also on the panels.
These guys are chatting from the last meeting.
Okay.
We need to kick them out.
Yeah. I'm not sure if I can come back
You have to leave by 2:30?
on the panel because I need to report to the program board on the status of initiatives. And that starts from 2:30.
Right. Okay.
So if I'm not here, don't wait for me.
Yeah. Well, I don't think, I thought this was on the I thought this was on the website, but it's not, right? The agenda was never posted?
The agenda is not. So we posted the description.
Right, that's what that is.
Yeah.
I didn't know we were going to be live streamed.
It's like we exercised this for several events last year, and then guys decided to do it for all meetings. We start at 1:30, right? So I'll kick them off.
Yeah, 4 minutes. Well, if you want to look, sure. But we should probably start in a couple minutes. Remy's here. I know the feeling. Great. Lembo's here. Remy's here. He was just having some water. Yasko was delayed. But he's in the audience. Yeah, okay, well, it's good. Okay, well, why don't we get started? Thanks to those of you who are either missing lunch or came back soon for this. Hopefully a few more people will join, but we appreciate your interest in this topic. My name is Bob Chen. My home base is Columbia University in New York, but I'm one of the co-chairs of the Geo Data Sharing Working Group. Actually, one of our other co-chairs, Yasko Kasai, was supposed to be here to do this intro, but she got delayed on her train from Tokyo, so she says she'll be here in about half an hour. There are actually 5, 6 co-chairs. I have the list later, but Zifo Taifoda is also one of the co-chairs from South Africa. He's just joined us, but he's jet-lagged coming in last night. And a couple other members, Remy Chandran, you'll hear from after I speak, and we have one of our longtime members, Steve Browdy, who will be speaking virtually via a recording. So our agenda this afternoon, I know it wasn't very explicit, will be a kind of an overview and history of the data sharing, data sharing within GEOSS, just to kind of bring you up to date. And then we have two main reports on current data sharing working group activities. The first will be on the implementation guidelines for the new GEOSS data sharing principles that Remy will give, and then, as I mentioned, Steve Browdy will give a virtual presentation on a national survey that we've been developing over the past 6 months. After that, we should have a little time for discussion. I don't think that we'll need the full 2 hours, but you may have other things you want to get to anyway. But anyway, we do hope that data sharing continues to be interesting and valued by GEOSS. Hopefully that's not reflected by the size of the audience, but we do know that it's been a important area of work at GEOSS, and we expect that to continue. So, so what I was going to kind of give a somewhat quick overview was really a little bit of where data sharing started within GEO back in really in 2005 and even a few years before in the early discussions about GEO. I'll kind of progress quickly through some of the processes that have gone on over the last more than 15 years, or more than 12 years, and we'll kind of bring you up to date, and then we'll talk about the ongoing and future prospects. Oops. So if some of you remember back in 2005, GEO had its first 10-year implementation plan, and that was accepted by the members of GEO at the time, and it included a whole set of language related to data sharing, in particular, that the benefits of Earth observations cannot be achieved without data sharing, and then it actually embodied in the plan itself the first version of the GEOSS data sharing principles. And that talked about full and open exchange of data, metadata, and products shared within GEOSS, recognizing relevant international instruments and national policies and legislation. There was a certain amount of discussion about what within GEOSS meant, since GEOSS was supposed to be a system of systems, and of course some uncertainty about what full and open exchange meant. The second principle was about how all shared data, metadata, and products would be made available with minimum time delay and at minimum cost. It didn't outrightly call for free data. And then all shared data, metadata, and products being free of charge or no more than the cost of reproduction will be encouraged for research and education. So that particular one was focused on the particular need related to research and education, and I think Remy will talk about that a little more later. So in the early GEO structure, there was a set of tasks that were established. Back then it was called DA0601, and actually a couple earlier this year, we as a group were looking back on our history, and we started to assemble a little table of events which are articulated here in this, which I won't go into in great detail. What I did want to say is at the time the Committee on Data for Science and Technology of the International Council for Science, which is now the International Science Council, was early participating. We weren't officially a participating organization. I think ICSU was, but we were active in the data policy arena, and was one of the only groups that was particularly interested in the data sharing piece. So I was Secretary General at the time, and we agreed to work on this task, which turned out to be basically leading the task. And so there were a number of activities at the time which led to a white paper on GEOSS data sharing and draft data sharing implementation guidelines, and that those were trying to address some of the ambiguity of the original principles and, you know, review the literature of what generally was agreed or meant by the terms like full and open sharing of data. So that was a lot of interaction, because back then these issues that we know now of open data were actually not that common, and you know, back then a lot of agencies sold their data, you know, had charges to make them available. Very few countries automatically distributed their data openly and freely. A few years later, I think at the 5th plenary, there was a formal effort to elevate the task into a task force, which meant that both countries and participating organizations were together in the same group addressing these data sharing issues. That task force had a number of meetings and telecons and activities, which led to a couple of products. One was a formal publication of the initial white paper, which came out in both CODATA's journal and a law journal, and then a formal the first set of implementation guidelines that were accepted at the GEOSS 6 plenary. And that task force continued for a few more years, working on things like case studies. And at that point, this thing called the GEOSS Data Core, data collection of open resources for everyone, was actually invented. And this was actually a fairly controversial point, because people felt that if you separated out the free and open ones, it somehow made the other data in GEOSS second class, and they didn't like that. But basically that was the intent. We wanted to create data resources that were as open as possible and shared without all sorts of restrictions. Of course, now we've made that the default, but back then it wasn't a given that everyone wanted all their data to be open and freely accessible. So that's one of the accomplishments of that action plan, which was to establish this framework and address a few other issues. For example, one of the important issues identified was, well, if you believe data is open, how do you not enforce it? How do you implement that in terms of legal licensing or open licensing or use of the public domain and so forth? And so there were a lot of issues that had to be worked out in a consensus to allow people to think about how that would work within the overall framework of GEOSS. So that white paper articulated some of the legal options and addressed some key implementation issues. At the end of 2011, there was a decision that the task force had accomplished its mission and needed to be reappointed as a working group. I'm not sure totally of the distinctions between those, but the current data sharing working group was then established in 2012, And of course, many of the people who are currently involved were involved back then, and that group has met consistently over the last 6 years, with usually 1 to 2 meetings a year and over 100 telecons. In this phase, we were really concerned with some implementation issues. We had this thing called the GEOSS data core, but how would data be identified as being in the core versus other, having other types of restrictions? There was a subgroup that was very focused on data quality issues that could be identified and addressed in sharing data, additional work on legal mechanisms for data sharing. And then after a couple of years, kind of the realization that the world had actually not only started catching up with the GEO community, but had actually jumped ahead in talking about open government data, open scientific data, and that GEOSS's original definition of full and open was not really as open, unrestricted, and pushing the envelope on data sharing as many in the community would like. And that led to a whole discussion about how to reword and expand the original data sharing principles into kind of a more modern approach. And that actually, I think, went reasonably quickly in terms of reformulating the text and making a proposal to the GEO plenary and ministerial. So that was done at the GEO 12 plenary, and some initial guidelines for the principles were proposed back in 2016. Maybe I have it later. There's, of course, the Mexico ministerial should have probably been mentioned in here too. It was the 2015 plenary. So this whole expanded approach was incorporated into the strategic plan for 2016 to 2025, again with a statement similar to the original that the benefits from Earth observations can only be fully achieved through the sharing of data, information, knowledge, products, and services. So a little bit of expansion beyond just data, metadata, and products. As of 2015, that probably should have said ministerial. So again, Remy will talk a little more about these data sharing principles, but here's the new version. We use the term open data by default to build on the open data movement internationally, but basically indicating that GEOSS members and participating organizations, by becoming part of or adding their data and resources into GEOSS, should be assuming that those data are open from the beginning and part of the data core without charge or restrictions on reuse. Now, one of the issues we did have to address in detail was whether registration of users and attribution were restrictions, but they don't really keep people from getting the data. They're really conditions on use. And so we made that distinction was important because people could still access the data. Registration doesn't prevent people from getting data. Attribution, of course, just is needed when the data is actually used. If you access it, keep it, don't do anything with it that you release, attribution doesn't necessarily have to happen. A little, again, I think Remy will talk a little bit more about the other two principles. But since then, the working group has worked on a couple parallel efforts. One is the new version of the implementation guidelines. I mentioned additional work on legal mechanisms to share data, and these documents are on the GEO website. There was another effort which was released a couple of years ago, looking at the value of open data sharing, trying to document not just whether Earth observations are themselves valuable and impactful, but where does the open data sharing contribute to that value. Certainly one of the trends we've seen last couple of years is how to move beyond data sharing. There was a whole effort to develop data management principles and implementation guidelines, and so there was an understanding that those needed to be coordinated and compatible with each other. And those data management, covered things that overlap with sharing on discoverability, accessibility, usability, preservation, and curation. And then a really important area which had been identified in the strategy was not, we're always concerned about the national capacity to generate and manage and use Earth observation data, but is there also the capacity to support open data sharing both internally and internationally? And do countries have the understanding and expertise to understand their own legal frameworks and their own responsibilities within international agreements and other legal frameworks to facilitate and encourage data sharing? Because if you don't understand it, then things tend to get boxed up and locked up and not shared. So having that capacity to know how every country's laws apply and how the different jurisdictional differences between countries affect rights to data and so forth is an important issue. So if you look at the 2017 to 2019 work program, there is this core initiative, I forget what it's called, on advancing GEOSS data sharing principles. And you can see these activities that I've kind of mentioned. There's one that's I think is fairly important, which is just the ability to track international open data trends. This is a rapidly changing field, and there's still a lot going on that's relevant. There's interest in how in specific sectors, in specific societal benefit areas, different groups have different traditions and legal basis for sharing data. For example, in humanitarian response versus biodiversity, there are different ways people have shared data. And a lot of interest in how one continues to demonstrate value from sharing. So just to wrap up, I thought I'd kind of try to look ahead a little bit at data sharing challenges. I put a little asterisk because these are mostly my thoughts. We didn't have a chance to kind of discuss it as a group, so I wouldn't say they're necessarily consensus on these, but certainly if you look at some of the strategy documents, you see these points. We don't have, even though we have the principles of open data by default, there's still a ways to go in terms of implementation. Barb Ryan, in her farewell message, kind of made that point, that we still don't have broad data sharing principles and policies and practices. Some of that might be helped by, for example, creating a model, text for legislation, that sort of thing. There is still not easy ways to overcome the barriers to legal interoperability. There is the most common license, Creative Commons, is translated to most national jurisdictions, but that's just one tool, and not everyone is comfortable with that approach. So, and then there's a lot of things that are in the gray area between data and products and services and so forth that aren't fully covered. So we still need work to expand the tools and I mean tools including legal instruments and licenses and things that could help with data sharing, especially when there's complications like confidentiality and national security concerns. You know, I think a growing issue is how does one start to have more trust in open data? People are concerned not just about the scientific quality, but the reliability of the data, who's responsible for it. If you're not paying for it, if you're not contracting for data where you have legal arrangement between two parties and you're just getting this data from some unknown source, how do you trust that not only that it's good data, but that it'll be there tomorrow when you need it, or during a crisis, or it might disappear because of, you know, change in budgets or something like that. How do we make sure that the data is there and transparent and has high levels of integrity? So there are a bunch of issues, I think, that affect data sharing in the future. At the same time, I think, you know, this is a broad trend. If there's a session this morning about the relationship between GEO and the UN Sustainable Development Agenda and some of the other conventions. And in a lot of these communities, open data sharing is really one of their key initiatives and realization that you have, in order to have integration across all the different sustainable development goals, in order to have cooperation on monitoring and development initiatives, you have to have open data that's trusted and transparent and so forth. In the scientific community, you may have heard of the FAIR principles. It's gaining a lot of traction in terms of not just acceptability, but also implementation approaches. As I mentioned, in the sustainable development community, there's a lot going on. So that's, I think, important for GEO and GEOSS to stay on top of those trends and really be at the forefront of moving ahead. And we have the capacity to implement these, I think, at lower cost and more efficiently than ever in the past. But we have to keep the technical and scientific interoperability in sync with issues related to legal interoperability, intellectual property, and so forth. Those need to be compatible. I think if you've seen the vision document that's been circulated under the new executive director, you know, he has been a long-time supporter of open data sharing, both in his home institution and within GEO community, and he's talking about the application of the FAIR principles both at the regional and global level. So with that, just here's the current co-chairs of the data sharing working group. We have a number of other active members whom I haven't listed, but we certainly could use greater participation. We were hoping to have a bit more critical mass here in Kyoto, but I think there's a lot of things going on this fall. But certainly any of us who are here and those who aren't would be, willing to talk to anybody who's interested in contributing. So we will welcome any additional participation and questions. We do have the plan was to have Yasko, when she gets here, and Remy and I available for questions, so we could just, how are we doing on time? Yeah, move on to Remy's discussion, unless there are quick questions. Okay, so Remy is going to talk about the implementation guidelines. I'll let you introduce yourself and great.
Thank you, Bob. And thanks for the very interesting presentation. I think you have covered most of the history of GEOSS, so I don't have to say much about it. And just to introduce myself, my name is Remy Chandran. I work with the National Institute for Environment Studies. I was previously with the Government of India and then moved to the UN. And now I'm back to a research institution. So before I explain about the data sharing principle, I want to tell you about my experience in India very, very briefly. I finished my master's in UCD in University College Dublin, and I came back to India and joined the remote sensing division. It was a state remote sensing center. It was in 1997. At the time, GEOSS was not formed. And when I joined, there was only one computer which had ArcGIS in it. And the data came from ISRO, which ISRO was well advanced, but the local remote sensing agencies were not. There were only one scientist who actually knew how to operate ArcGIS. So with that, he became very powerful also. He was the master of all the data. So if he is on leave, if he's sick, or if he's on holiday, you're not able to access any of the data. Apparently, he was also the custodian of the ArcGIS, and nobody could access his computer. So one day, what happened, there was a landslide in a remote area in Kerala. And the government asked for the data because they want some geospatial data to do the planning. But it was told that the person is on a holiday and he won't be back for another 10 days. So that is, I was just talking about the situation in 1997, how restricted information was. But that was because the organization didn't have a data management policy. It didn't think much about how this data would have been so critical during a time when there was a need for management during disasters. So we are just evolving out of it. The geospatial data has been there for a long time. It's been there since, I don't know, Bob, you know it better. You've been working on it for ages. But the process of data sharing, the process of communication of data is primitive. And I think that was my interest when I contacted Bob about that. I want to join the geospatial working group and to discuss, to be part of it. So it is still in a very nascent stage, and I'm in a way, very happy that it's evolving, and then thanks to your effort for a long-term effort with you, Bob, for bringing it up, and now we have evolving from that and getting things better. So my role here is to explain, I think, the good work already done by Bob and colleagues to bring a guideline for data sharing, and which is through the principles of data sharing principles. So to give an introduction, you know, as I told you about the story about when we were not able to share data, even if it was available. So, but since the formation of GEOSS, since 2005, there has been a very good progress in the data sharing mechanism. And one good thing is there is at least a guideline, there is a framework on how data should be managed. So since 2005 and till now, it is slow, but it is evolving and it is growing, and many countries have started participating. So in the next thing is we also see a lot of government, scientific institutions, and technical operation coming forward. And they're all part of this data sharing working group, and they're all contributing to the different policies of the implementation plan. So the role of GEOSS has been always to facilitate these countries and institutions to come together and then to share the process. And I think Bob has already explained how it is done from 2005 to the recent Mexican declaration as well, and how things have evolved so far. So I think, so the new guideline has actually created a map for how to share the information, what data should be shared, and how it can be shared. So this also gives a very good support for governments who didn't have a data sharing policy. Many of the government, even today, many of the government, am I right, Bob? Many of the governments even today don't have a data sharing policy, not only about geodata, about data itself, but the huge volume of data, both national data as well as private geospatial data, which is a huge volume of data, is also coming in. And it is time that we have a guideline on this matter. So the main role of the Secretariat is, of course, to mobilize data to address the pressing global problems, which are related to, as I said, natural hazards, humanitarian issues, and things like that. And to address, in a longer term, to address a sustainable development goal that's in 2030. And then you have to promote open data and maintain dialogue. Now, in many of the governments, primarily, they want to share the data, but they're constrained in opening up the data. So I think the three principles, Bob, that you defined is very critical. One is the core GEOSS data core, which I will talk about it later as well, which is a very important step forward as well. Then the third part is to contribute to the national and the international open data initiative. There are several of the open data initiatives that are currently available, so it is the idea is to contribute to address and complement these issues as well. And all these points are mentioned already in the Mexico City Declaration, which was in November 13, 2015. So 2015 was probably the last meeting that we had on GEOSS data sharing. So as I said before, the open data trend has also evolved considerably since 2005. And as Bob mentioned earlier, there was a Beijing meeting, a ministerial declaration in 2010, which announced the creation of GEOSS data collection of open resources for everyone. You would imagine the government of China even have opened up the spatial data on which is collected by the Chinese satellite data as well. JAXA and related Japanese satellites also have a very good open data policy as well. And all these have evolved due to the participation of GEOSS and of course, a contribution from the data sharing working group as well. So one of the criteria is that for creating this openness is requesting all GEO members who are participant GEO members to endorse a GEO strategy 2016-25, including the data sharing principles. So once we adopt it, then we have a uniform pattern of data collection, data sharing, and we can define what can be shared and what cannot be shared as well. Now, when we talk about data sharing principle, one of the biggest problems countries may have is regarding ownership. Now, GEO does not own the data. If I'm right, they don't own the data. GEOSS is a repository of a system of systems. That means the data actually belongs to the countries. So the countries do not have to worry of the copyrights, or what has to be shared is the prerogative of the country. And the revised GEO data sharing principles have actually accommodated these issues in their vision as well. So, and I talked about the three, I think Bob also mentioned clearly about the three principles which are the core of the data sharing process, which is called the GEOSS data core. That is, GEOSS data core is the one that is talking about data which is open and available to all, to everyone. I think the formation of GEO data core is Bob was involved in during the deliberation of the sessions, and I think it is probably one of the most easy way for anyone to get any data. When it's a core data, probably it says it's an open data. It has less restrictions. You can easily move in when you get those information. So it comes under the first principle and emphasize the value of GEOS and the GEO community. The second principle brings with an exception that the possibility of sharing data has some restriction, because geospatial data also has security related issues, or some of the data cannot be openly shared. So those data, the countries have the right to put it under the second principle, which includes some kind of restriction. So we don't say that all geo data should be shared, but the ones that can be shared should be shared, and then that are not can be put under the restricted category. So putting all this compartmentalizing of all this information would actually lead to a very organized or structured way of information sharing as well. So these restrictions, when we talk about restrictions, there are international instruments, national policies, and legislation. So you may, if you attend any of the international conferences, you can see there's a close working group which talk about restricted information and restricted data as well. So the second principle holds very well when it comes to GEOS data sharing. Now, the second principle, when it's actually contradicts the whole point of the GEOS data sharing process, because we are talking about open data. But in the second principle, we are actually contradicting. We are saying, hey, wait a minute, not all data are open. But that is a reality, and we have to accept the reality. If you have to move forward, we have to say that there is certain things that we can share and certain things we cannot share. And if we identify what can be shared and what cannot be shared, then it is easy for us to use those data or plan those data in a very systematic manner. So the three, So the third principle puts emphasis on the provision of data through GEOS with minimum time delay. And that is, as I talked about my earlier example about data being in a computer repository and not being available for disaster management because the person went on a leave, on a holiday for 1 week. So in those circumstances, time is a factor. Time is very important. It is like an emergency, and you need those information as early and fast as possible means. So we have having a data sharing laws and regulations, we should also put this time factor into consideration, which is very important, because any data with time, it's important, but sometimes it becomes unimportant for certain periods, certain issues, and certain things. So that is the three principles that comes under, and very critical, which has been very well included in this as well. So there is also a guidance, the data sharing principle. It also talks about the guidance for GEO members and participating organization, and that is well outlined in the Geneva Ministerial Declaration of 2014, which highlights how the GEO vision agreed in 2003 remains relevant for the next GEO decade as well. And you can see it's already outlined in the strategic plan, where the vision is to realize a future wherein decisions and actions for the benefit of humankind are informed, well coordinated, comprehensive, and sustained Earth observation and information. So the three factors that has to be considered are, of course, the economic factors. There is a huge benefit in data sharing. You can see the telecom industry, how they have expanded, how they have used it, open data, open geo data, for example, Google Maps and other related issues for bringing up more economic related benefits. And then there's a societal related benefit, not mainly on the transboundary level, climate change, biodiversity issues as well. And the third one is, of course, research and innovation. And if anyone who has worked on geospatial data and as a researcher, you would find that it is sometimes very difficult to get spatial data. Even getting a small shapefile from a country would be difficult, because they'd say, well, it is restricted. So having a forum, of being a member group of GEOS would really help to bring such research communities together and to help move forward with a very systematic way on how to do research using the government-related geospatial data as well. And the third and further benefits are, of course, on education and capacity development. Now, we need maps to speak about locations and regions and the growth and population. Everything is shown in a map. So now it is important to know the socioeconomic statistics of a region, to do planning as well, and for educational needs as well. Finally, and then the governance part is one of the key areas, and that's one of my core area of research as well. And I think this is where that we need to emphasize on, which is an emphasis on information for improving good governance is another key factor as well. So we all call for open public data generally build societal freedom and trust in governance and its many functions as well. So this is just about a very guideline on how to register the data, but I'm not going deep into it, and this is more on the technical side and what has to do, but this is already outlined well in the guidelines as well. So the last one, which is an important one, is again for the legal interoperability and the legal use conditions imposed on each data set allow creation and use of combined or derivative products as well. So sometimes there are legal restrictions on the data, but the restrictions may not be, for example, the restriction would be from information moving from internationally between national governments, but it will be open within the government itself. So those data can actually, if you work through research institution properly, that could benefit the research part or bring those data through a research mechanism into the global scale as well. So that is some of the way of working on the interoperability side as well. And finally, I just want to show the benefit of data sharing. This is an example of one of my projects in Africa, which is called the Wildlife Enforcement Monitoring System, which you can see it is 7 countries are sharing information on wildlife crime. And, wildlife crime means there are several ministries involved, which is the Ministry of Environment, Ministry of Security. It means mainly the internal security and enforcement-related organizations. But when it comes to this initiative, all those countries, all these agencies are sharing the data, and you can see in East Africa and Congo how the sharing of data has shown how has given some quantitative value of the number of species recorded per country, species involved, and the value of the species as well. So you can see sharing of data is also beneficial because illegal trade is transboundary issue, but spatial data sharing has actually showed how serious, for example, on the East Africa side, you can show how serious the issue has been. So on a map scale, it has been very, very productive as well. So anyway, thanks so much. And if you have any questions, please feel free to ask. Thank you.
Steve Browdy's video. While I'm setting this up, Jasko, do you want to introduce yourself as co-chair of the session and one of the data sharing working group? Yeah, I didn't mention that you've recently joined as co-chair, replacing Dave Halpern, who'd been COSPAR's representative for quite a long time, but we're definitely welcome to have you participate and bring kind of a different perspective on sharing coming out of the space sciences. As I mentioned, this issue of national capacity for data sharing is really critical, and stop this, restart it. And so we've been doing quite a bit to work on sharing. Now, hopefully this will be audible. It's going to come from the speaker, so if you're having trouble hearing once it starts, let me know. Okay, so.
Good afternoon. I'd like to talk a little bit about the work that the analysis team within the data sharing working group has been doing with regards to the new design of the data sharing survey. First, a short history and what our plan is. The analysis of the first release of the survey that we had took place in the spring of 2018, earlier this year. Because of that analysis, we decided that we needed to redesign the survey a bit and to take into account some new key features we'd like to have. So that redesign started in the summer of 2018, and we are almost ready to release the beta release for that new design survey. We'd like to send it to about 10 to 20 national contacts by the end of the year, with a wide release to all national contact points of GEO members in early 2019. The reasons for the survey haven't changed. There are two basic reasons. We want to establish a data sharing baseline among all GEO members to identify strengths and weaknesses in data sharing practices. And the data sharing working group is also using the survey in support of what we believe to be the importance of data sharing and to measure its benefits as the data sharing practice evolves. The survey has four main questions, or question groups. The first question group deals with data policy information, and this is allowed to be entered both at the national and at the agency level. The question two group deals with data portal information, and again, These pieces of information can be entered both for national and agency level portals. Question 3 deals with data sharing coordination, and this is really at the national level only. We're interested in what the national coordination efforts are. And the question 4 group deals with use cases of shared Earth observation data. And this can be entered in various ways. I'll show you a little bit later. But essentially, we want these use cases to be links to the geo-societal benefit areas and various international agendas like the Sustainable Development Goals. So some key features of the new design survey. We've harmonized the ability to enter information for national data policies so that you don't have to, in the previous version of the survey, you had to go through a national section first and then an agency section. Now we just let you enter information for policies at one time, and you can specify on each policy form whether it's national or agency level. We also allow for the submitting of drafts while you're editing your responses to the survey. And you can enter information and save drafts as many times as you want until you're ready to finally submit it. You can enter new and changed information and resubmit at any time. Originally, we were thinking of doing this once a year, but some countries may change information about their data sharing practices more than once a year. So now you can enter this information at any time. And you can also pull up your most recently passed information that you submitted to get a baseline for making changes for any new information needed to be entered. We validate the fields prior to submission as much as possible, and if there are errors or things missing, we alert you to that fact so you can make the changes prior to submission. And you can also run some reports based on submissions, yours and others. The recommended quality control for the survey is important. We've instituted a mechanism to follow up with national contact points to improve the response quality of the survey. So the first phase of the quality control is that the analysis team will look through the responses and add comments to a response where we have deemed it necessary for a follow-up to take place with the national contact point. And then phase 2 of the quality control process would be for either the data sharing working group or the GEOSS Secretariat or a combination of both of them to reach out to these national contact points in order to clarify the question that needs to be altered and allow for that national contact to come back and revisit the survey and change the information or add any missing information. The next steps for us is to release the beta version of the redesigned survey, to issue a wide distribution of the survey to all GEO members, to establish a stronger analysis baseline for data sharing efforts, to highlight the importance of responding to this survey so that we can gauge the success and evolution of data sharing. And of course, we remain committed to open data sharing and want to use the survey to show its benefits for member countries. The analysis team is made up of about 9 or 10 individuals who meet once a week to be able to go through this, redesign it, test it, and ultimately to analyze the responses. And they're all thanked very much for all their efforts, which of course is all voluntary. So let's look at the survey. These are current snapshots of the survey as it currently exists. It's still going through some changes due to debugging, but there won't be any substantive changes from what you're seeing here. So there's an instructions page which just goes through and gives somebody some information as to what to expect, what to do while they're answering questions on the survey. Contact information is necessary for follow-up and obviously for login or authentication information. Notice that all required fields have a little red asterisk. This is fairly standard in form submissions. Also, you'll see at the bottom of every page that there's a button to go to the next question or next tab, and there's also a button for saving the information in draft form. And where applicable, there will also be a button for going to the previous question or tab. So on to question 1. So this is the first question or set of fields for entering information about data policies. And so you'll see that the first column, the far left, is basically the labels for the fields that you need to enter. Where you see little circles of question marks, those are tooltips. And so if you hover over them, you'll see some instructions. And I'll show you that in a second. From the next column, you'll see that you enter information. And you can go to the previous or next column. Now, that's important to understand because you see these buttons, add another policy and remove policy. I'll show you that in a second, but add another policy allows you to keep adding policies as long as you have policies to add. Although you'll only see 2 columns at most, so you have to be able to scroll from where you currently are to the next one or go back to the previous one. But you can never go previous to the first one, obviously. Now, these aren't all the questions, so let me just show you the rest of the questions from the bottom of the page. So these are the rest of the questions. Notice that the tooltips don't just exist for the label of the question, but also sometimes on the question itself are the fields that need to be entered so that you can understand what's being asked for. And at the bottom, notice that the buttons say you can go back to contact information, forward to question 2, or to save a draft. There is a pop-up of a tooltip. If you had clicked on that question mark, you get a little pop-up that gives you information about what that field means. And now, if you clicked on the Add Another Policy, you get a second column. That second column looks exactly like the first column, except that the information you put in there would be specific to another policy. And then once you've got 2 or more columns, you'll only see these 2 columns other than the label column. And once you have more than 2, you can use the next and previous links to move back and forth between them. And if you want to remove a policy, you just click the button that says remove, and it'll remove that column, and all the other information that you have there for any other columns will still be there. You cannot remove the last column. There always has to be 1 column showing. And when you're about to enter information, if you want to call up, now this isn't implemented yet, but if you want to call up the last submitted information that you had for your country, you'll be able to click a button to do that. And in the first policy column, you'll see the information that was last submitted. And then you can either change that or add to it with new policies. So on to question 2, which deals with data portals. The same basic structure exists. You can add another portal, which will give you a second column or more. When you have 2 or more columns, you can remove columns. In this case, remove a portal. You can scroll between next and previous ones, and you enter the questions. The remainder of the questions for this set of fields is shown now. And on the bottom, again, you can see you can go back to question 1, you can go forward to question 3, or you can save a draft. On to question 3. This has to do with national coordination. So these are just questions that need to be answered for the coordination effort at your country for data sharing. There aren't multiple columns for this question. There's just a coordination effort. We're assuming a single coordination effort. And these are the remaining questions at the bottom of the screen that you would see. Now notice that there's a question there called select a frequency. It says frequency of coordination efforts. Throughout the survey there are many drop-down boxes, and if you click on it, you basically get a pop-up that gives you possible things to choose from. Some of these drop-downs are single selection, and some of them are multiple selection. For this one in particular, it's a single selection. You have a single frequency for when your coordination efforts occur. On to question 4. These are the use case questions. This also allows multiple columns. You can add and remove use cases according to the same rules as for data policies and data portals. If you have 2 or more use cases, you can remove 1 or more until you get down to 1 use case. And if you have 2 or more, you can slide between or scroll between the next and the previous ones. The remaining questions for this for the use cases is shown here. Again, you can go back to question 3. You can save a draft. Now, when you're on the last page, this is the last page of the survey or last tab. When you're on question 4, you can submit. You have to go to question 4 to submit, so you've gone through all the questions. Although you can go back and forth between the different question sets and the different tabs whenever you want. But if you want to submit, you have to come here to question 4. And when you click submit, your information would be first validated, and you would be made aware of any problems that existed in your answers that you'd have to fix. But after that's done, you hit submit again, and it will go ahead and submit. And the information gets stored in a database. And since it's in a database, we can query that database and run reports. So having finished the survey, the next thing to do is to run reports. So there'll be a page you can go to run reports. Now, we're not done designing the reports, but this is just here as a placeholder to give you some idea. So the reports that would be available publicly are to look for the most recent submission by country, which means when you click on that, you would get a list of countries that you could pick 1 or 2 or 5 countries that you want a report from. But if you want reports for the whole list of countries, for all countries that have submitted information, you would click on the next button, which says most recent submission for all countries. And that would be a comprehensive aggregated list of all the information for all the country submissions. And then you can get analysis reports by region or for all countries, which also probably should say for the world. But the difference between an analysis report and a submission is that the submission just gives you the actual pieces of information that were submitted. An analysis report would go through and give statistical information. For instance, you might see pie charts about, how many data policies there were for different countries, and different types of analysis information that the analysis team has put together. And that will be extracted from the database, and the report will be generated in real time. Now, if you're logged in as a national contact point or as just a person in the public, these public reports are the only ones that you can see. But if you're logged in as a member of the GEOSS Secretariat or the Data Sharing Working Group, you would also get access to other types of information, which would just be for the Secretariat or for specific people working on the reports and on the surveys. And these, in this case, and what I'm showing is just some submission log information or a list of contact points. So this information is sort of private, not open for public consumption. We'll be adding to this list. There'll be many more types of reports that we'll be able to run. This is just to show you what can be, what it will look like and the sorts of things you can do. So in conclusion, if you're submitting information, there's a process you go through. So first you'd authenticate, basically log in. You'd retrieve submitted information if you want to be able to edit. Once you're in a position to start editing or entering new information, you do that. You change existing information, you enter new information. You can save that information as a draft if you're not completed with it yet. And so the circulation of the green arrows, that you can stay in this part of the process for as long as you want, continuing to save a draft, come back and change information, save a draft, come back and change information, as many times as you want. And then when you're done, you would submit or acknowledge the information. The system will validate you and then submit it. Submit an acknowledgement. Let me explain that really quick. If you're entering new information that's never been entered before, you would submit it, and it goes into the database and it's timestamped so that we know when the submission was from the national contact point. If you have looked at the information, say you called up the existing information that was last submitted, you look through it and nothing's changed, but you want to basically put a timestamp on it to say that you've looked at it as of a certain date and time and you acknowledge that it's still current. That would be acknowledging it. And either way puts a timestamp on it, and then the GEOSS Secretariat knows what's the latest date and time that the national contact point either entered new information or acknowledged that the current information is still current. Well, that's about it. Thank you for listening, and if you have any questions, I'm sure that there's somebody there that can answer them. Goodbye.
Great. Well, I hope that was fairly clear. Steve has done this a couple times, and as you can see, there's a fair amount of thinking and planning that went into this. Originally, I think we were thinking of just kind of initial information gathering, but as time went on, we realized it would make more sense to create this as a tool that could be used not just to create this baseline, but also to continue to collect and update information so that it's, not one of those things you just do once and then forget about and then have to reinvent the wheel later. So we're hoping that this has some, longevity and utility over time. If, any of you, have thoughts about that, about what we're asking, about the structure and, whether it makes sense, we'd welcome that. And in particular, as he indicated, we're looking for beta testers. So anyone who's interested in being a beta tester, that would be helpful. If you have some familiarity with national policies and would be in a position to enter that kind of information, we certainly want to make sure that the questions are clear and the process is as smooth as possible. So any quick questions about this survey? Anything that Steve mentioned? Okay. So originally we had been hoping to have a speaker from the World Data System, but that didn't work out. So I think at this point we just wanted to have the opportunity to interact, more informally with you about these issues. Remy, do you want to come on up to the stage? We could maybe get another chair or whatever. Ziffo, are you awake enough to come up, or do you want to just, no? Okay. And if there are not any specific questions, we can wrap up. But Remy, why don't you come up on the stage, and you can either stand or you can sit. And Yaska, since you came a little late, you're welcome to make any comments on your own. Well, I don't know, with a camera, maybe I should go over there, but yeah. Oh, okay. This is usually easier unless we get feedback. So if anybody has questions, I guess because we're being webcast, you should use a mic, but can't tell if anybody has any questions or comments. Did you want to say anything that you might have said in your intro to get people?
Actually, data sharing seems to quite well organized, but we didn't talk about, for example, data quality. What is there anybody who have comments on that?
What specifically? we have had, we didn't talk about them in detail, but there are data quality guidelines that we've tried to coordinate with some of the other geo activities.
Yeah, but it's we have more data and more sharing data, which means it's quite difficult to keep good quality of data for all of them.
Sure. Any questions, comments, thoughts? Everybody's.
No, I was just curious if there was anyone from the National Focal Point, from the government in the audience. So you should put something as well.
Is there a mic back there? I think you have to come up.
Okay, thanks Bob and the team for the work that you've done. I think you caught me off guard a bit, and I'll play roughly as a player because I'm part of the data sharing working group, and I also work with the colleagues of mine who's a national contact point for South Africa on looking on the issues related to data sharing within South Africa. I think one thing I'll just mention, I'll just have a comment. I think one thing we've experienced within having a national contact point at the government level, the feedback we give is much more broad and policy. And we tend to have little information regarding the technical part of data sharing. So at some point, I think we've tried to actually to make the survey, for example, much more useful. We'd actually try to look at also putting the technical contact point, just to give the technical component of the national data sharing landscape. So I think it's something that we should keep in mind, that we want to get as much information as possible. The national contact point at the government level has access to relevant stakeholders and can request all the relevant information, but we should always open that loop to make sure that we get the technical component of it on the surveys. Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, well, I think that's certainly input we can give to the subgroup. There's always a trade-off between not overloading surveys with so many questions that other people, it doesn't get filled out. So, but I take your point about that, so we can pass that along. Bob, you have a question?
Yeah, Bob Samores, Belmont Forum. I've been away from GEO for a couple of years now, so I don't know where things stand in terms of data sharing requirements in each of the different work program activities. Is there something compulsory within each activity that GEO now requires?
Yeah, you raise a point that we tried to address. I think it was at the DC summit where there was a panel that had had representative initiatives to try to talk to them about their data sharing practices. I mean, I don't think there's been any ruling. Everybody in theory adheres to the general statements, I know there's certainly interest in trying to encourage each SBA to push open access as much as they're comfortable with, or that the community is going. And so there was some allusion to that, and I think one of the points about needing to understand the data sharing landscape in individual SBAs. Not a lot's happened on that, partly because I don't think we have the enough volunteers and with the right expertise. Paul Eulier, I think, was one, and he kind of rotated off once he changed his original job. So that's, I think, an open area in terms of, you know, what different initiatives are doing and willing to do to fully implement the data sharing vision that everybody's bought into.
You know, just follow up from the Belmont Forum perspective, which is a different animal. I mean, it's scientific peer-reviewed research, but there are data management planning requirements now built into every call for proposals. And over time, it will become much more of a determinant on funding as well as evaluation. I wonder if it's something the data sharing working group in some, you know, some iteration of something like that might want to consider developing and putting forward and implementing over time.
Well, maybe the executive director will push on that issue at some point. Any comments on this?
I think it's a very, very, very important point because when we talk about science and policy, we're still far behind in actually implementing scientific technology, scientific findings into policy. And one of the reason is, of course, not the availability of data. I won't say it is the data is not available, but it is actually not enough sharing of data. And of course, there are, you know, it's a very utopian concept to have a evidence-based policy, but at least with this data sharing working group and this new framework that is developed, I think there is going to be a new evolution in the way science gets into policy as well. So I think the Belmont Forum is also working towards that as well, I understand. So does Future Earth and related initiatives. And I think one thing that would be also important to see is how these help meet the sustainable development goals as well. So there's a lot of work on our side as well. So we as scientists and policymakers have to come together and to engage as well in the data sharing process as well. Thanks.
Other questions or comments? You know, unfortunately, the representative from the World Data System couldn't make it here. They have CoData, Research Data Alliance, and the World Data System have a big meeting next week in Botswana, as some of you may know. So they weren't tied up. But I think having the World Data System involved in GEO is one area that hasn't been as strong as in the past, and I think you know, they've adopted the kind of open data sharing as well and bring to bear the actual, you know, community of people actually work with very specific data sets that are relevant to GEO. So you know, having them be part of the community and actually actively working to implement open data sharing is, I think, important. And, you know, I was hoping they'd be here to participate in that conversation, but that's another area. Many of them do work with specific SBA communities, and so they have kind of more hands-on involvement in the actual data management in those areas. Any other questions, issues anybody's thinking? A few latecomers, but we're losing the people. No. Okay, gone. I'm sure you can use an extra half hour. There's certainly some interesting sessions going on elsewhere. But thanks for your time, and hope this was at least interesting, and I'm glad we have it on the record, I guess. Well, people will be able to send in their comments later or whatever. But thanks a lot. Thanks, everybody, and to my colleagues and our absent Steve Browdy, who actually put in a lot of effort to kind of get that to work right. But thanks, everybody. Bye-bye. So you weren't hurt in the accident? You said there was an accident.
Yeah, accident for the not traffic accident, but for the security incident in my institute, and I had to care about that.
Oh, yeah.
It was not very good time.
Oh, that's too bad. You mean so things were disrupted at your institute and you could...
Yeah. My student did it. My student got the bad email and he distributed.
How?
We understand that is why.
Oh, you mean IT?
Yes.
Oh, that's too bad.
Yeah, so
Yeah, those are always difficult. But I'm glad you could still make it, I think. Are you able to stay for more of the meeting this week?
Yes, I will back to Tokyo tonight, and I will come back for Wednesday and Thursday.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Oh, because you're on the delegation
Yeah.
for CoSPAR.
Yeah. No. I have two positions.
Yeah.
One
right.
is COSPA, one is ministry.
Oh, you're also on the Japanese delegation?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, I was giving this out in the other session that I was in. This is from my center.
Oh.
It's a free, it has a Creative Commons license on the page.
Oh. Is it for me?